Captain Jake Morrison sat in his chair on the bridge of the New Horizon and watched the stars through the main screen. His coffee was getting cold, but he did not care much about that right now. The ship was humanity's first real attempt at deep space travel, and Jake felt proud to be part of it. His crew was small but good at their jobs. Lisa Carter was the best pilot he had ever worked with, and she could fly anything that had engines. Tony Rodriguez knew machines better than most people knew their own families, and he could fix problems that would make other engineers cry. Dr. Amy Watson was excited about finding alien life, and she had been talking about it for months before they left Earth. They were supposed to check out the Kepler 442 system and see what they could find there. The mission was simple and nobody expected much trouble. Earth had sent them out with the new experimental warp drive that the scientists said would work perfectly. Jake had learned not to trust scientists who said things would work perfectly, but he kept that thought to himself. Lisa was running checks on the navigation system when the ship started making noises that sounded wrong. Tony looked up from his engineering station with a frown on his face. The lights flickered and Jake felt his stomach drop as the ship began to shake. Amy grabbed her chair and asked what was happening, but nobody had a good answer for her. The warp drive was supposed to take them a few light years from Earth, but something went very wrong. The shaking got worse and the lights went out completely for a few seconds. When they came back on, Jake could see through the main screen that they were not where they were supposed to be. The stars looked different and there was something big happening in front of them. Space was full of ships that were nothing like anything humans had ever built. They were sleek and beautiful, and they were shooting at each other with weapons that made the space around them glow with different colors. Jake counted at least 30 ships on each side of what was clearly a major battle. Some of the ships were huge and others were small and fast. They moved in ways that seemed impossible, and their weapons created explosions that lit up the darkness of space like fireworks. Tony was working frantically at his station trying to figure out where they were while Lisa tried to keep their ship from drifting into the middle of the fight. Amy had her face pressed against a side window and she was making excited noises about seeing actual alien technology in action. Jake thought that maybe they should be more worried about the fact that they were in the middle of a war zone, but his crew seemed to be handling it well. The battle was incredible to watch. The alien ships moved like dancers and their weapons created patterns of light that were almost too beautiful to be deadly. Jake found himself wondering what kind of people could build ships like that and what they were fighting about. One side had ships that were dark and angular, while the other side had ships that were bright and smooth. It was easy to tell them apart, even though Jake had no idea which side was winning. The fight went on for about 20 minutes and then suddenly it was over. The dark angular ships had won and they were gathering around what looked like the wreckage of several bright smooth ships. Jake watched as the winners began moving in formation toward a distant star. He was about to suggest that they try to slip away quietly when one of the dark ships changed course and started coming toward them. Lisa asked if they should run, but Jake decided that would probably make them look guilty of something. He told Tony to make sure all their weapons were powered down and their communications were open. Amy was practically bouncing in her chair with excitement about making first contact with an alien species. Jake thought that maybe he should be more nervous, but he was mostly just curious about what would happen next. The alien ship was beautiful up close. It was bigger than the New Horizon and covered in what looked like armor that reflected light in strange ways. Jake could see weapons ports and sensor arrays that were clearly more advanced than anything humans had built. When the ship positioned itself next to them, Jake could see movement behind what might have been windows. The communications system made a noise and then a voice spoke in a language that sounded like music mixed with thunder. The universal translator that the scientist had insisted would work perfectly made some clicking sounds and then began to speak in English. The voice was deep and commanding, and it asked them to identify themselves and state their purpose in Xanthari space. Jake pressed the communication button and introduced himself and his crew. He explained that they were explorers from Earth and that they had gotten lost due to a problem with their drive system. He apologized for showing up in the middle of what looked like an important battle and asked if they needed any help with cleanup or medical assistance. He tried to sound friendly and helpful because that seemed like the right approach. There was a long silence before the alien voice responded. It asked if the humans were aware that they had just witnessed a military engagement between the Xanthari Empire and rebel forces. Jake said that he had figured it was something like that, and again offered to help if they needed anything. Amy added that they would be very interested in learning about Xanthari culture, and Tony mentioned that their ships looked really well designed. The alien ship moved closer, and the voice told them that they would be escorted to the nearest Xanthari outpost for processing. Jake said that sounded fine and asked if there was anything they should know about local customs or protocols. Lisa added that they had brought some Earth food if their new friends wanted to try something different. The silence that followed was even longer than the first one. Jake looked at his crew and realized that they were all handling this first contact situation pretty well. Amy was taking notes about everything she was seeing, and Tony was already sketching some of the alien ship designs. Lisa was flying in formation with their escort like they had been doing it for years. Jake settled back in his chair and watched the stars as they headed toward their first meeting with an alien civilization. The Xanthari outpost was massive and impressive, and Jake felt like a tourist visiting a really good museum. The docking bay they were directed to could have held 20 ships the size of the New Horizon, and there were alien vessels of all shapes and sizes parked in neat rows. Amy was taking pictures of everything while Tony was already pointing out interesting design features to Lisa, who was flying their ship with her usual skill. When they landed, Jake could see aliens working on various ships and moving cargo around, with machines that floated in the air without making any noise. The aliens themselves were tall and had gray skin that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. They moved with a grace that made Jake think of professional dancers, and their large eyes seemed to take in everything around them. A group of Xanthari officials met them at the airlock, and Jake shook hands with all of them, even though they seemed surprised by the gesture. The leader introduced himself as Commander Zeltok and explained that he would be handling their processing and evaluation. Jake thanked him for the welcome and said that they were excited to learn about Xanthari culture and technology. Amy immediately started asking questions about their biology and social structure, while Tony wanted to know about their engineering techniques. Lisa complimented the design of the docking bay and asked about their traffic control systems. Commander Zeltok looked confused by their enthusiasm and kept glancing at his subordinates as if he was not sure what to do with them. They were escorted through corridors that were works of art in themselves. The walls displayed moving images of what Jake assumed were important moments in Xanthari history, and the ceiling was covered with lights that shifted colors as they walked beneath them. Amy was trying to record everything while taking notes about alien psychology and social organization. Tony was examining the construction techniques and making appreciative noises about their building methods. The first real problem happened when they entered what was clearly a ceremonial chamber. There was a tall statue in the center of the room that seemed to be made of some kind of crystal that glowed with its own light. Tony walked right up to it and started examining the base to see how the lighting effect was achieved. When he touched it to test the material, several Xanthari guards made sharp hissing sounds and moved toward him with their hands on their weapons. Jake quickly stepped between Tony and the guards and explained that his engineer was just curious about their technology and meant no disrespect. Commander Zeltok looked like he was having trouble deciding whether to arrest Tony or just throw all of them out of the station. Amy started asking about the religious significance of the statue and whether it represented a specific deity or historical figure. The situation got worse when they were brought to meet Governor Velthar, who was apparently the ranking official at the outpost. The governor was even taller than the other Xanthari and wore robes that seemed to be made of metal threads that caught and reflected light. He sat on what was clearly a throne and had several guards standing behind him with weapons that hummed with energy. Jake walked up to the throne and introduced himself and his crew with the same friendly manner he had used with Commander Zeltok. Governor Velthar stared at him for a long moment, and then spoke in a voice that was deep and commanding. He asked if the humans understood that they were in the presence of imperial authority and that proper respect was required. Amy chose that moment to sit down in an ornate chair that was positioned near the throne because she said her feet were getting tired from all the walking. Lisa wandered over to examine some decorative weapons that were mounted on the wall and started asking about their function and design. Tony was looking up at the ceiling and making notes about the structural engineering. Jake told the governor that they certainly respected his authority and were grateful for the hospitality they had been shown. He asked about the governmental structure of the Xanthari Empire, and whether they had ever considered implementing democratic reforms to improve citizen participation. He mentioned that humans had found that people generally worked better when they had a voice in their government. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the humming of various machines throughout the chamber. Governor Velthar slowly rose from his throne and walked down to where Jake was standing. He was at least 2 feet taller than Jake, and his eyes seemed to glow with their own light. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it seemed to fill the entire room. He asked Jake if he understood that the Xanthari Empire controlled over 3,000 worlds and that entire species had surrendered rather than face their military might. He explained that most beings who came before him were unable to speak due to fear, and that many had died simply from being in his presence. He wanted to know why the humans showed no sign of terror or submission. Jake thought about that for a moment and then said that the governor seemed like a reasonable person who was just doing his job. He mentioned that humans had dealt with their share of difficult leaders throughout history, and that most problems could be solved through honest communication and mutual respect. Amy added that from a psychological standpoint, the governor's intimidation techniques were quite sophisticated, and she wondered if she could interview him about leadership methods. Tony looked up from his examination of the ceiling and mentioned that the governor might want to have someone check the structural supports in the east corner, because he could see some stress fractures that might become problems later. Lisa suggested that the weapons display could be improved with better lighting to show off the craftsmanship. Governor Velthar returned to his throne and sat down heavily. He told Commander Zeltok to prepare quarters for the humans and arrange for them to be transported to the imperial capital. When Jake asked if that was an invitation to continue their cultural exchange, the governor said that it was something like that. As they were escorted to their quarters, Jake noticed that many of the aliens they passed stopped what they were doing to stare at them. Some seemed amazed while others looked confused or frightened. Amy was taking notes about their reactions, while Tony continued to examine the architecture and engineering. Lisa asked their escort about the local food and whether they had anything similar to coffee. Jake realized that they might have gotten themselves into something more complicated than a simple first contact situation, but he was not sure exactly what it was. The Xanthari seemed friendly enough even if they were a bit formal, and their technology was certainly impressive. He looked forward to seeing their capital and learning more about their civilization. News of the fearless humans spread through the Xanthari Empire faster than Jake would have thought possible. During their journey to the imperial capital, their escort ship received constant communications from other vessels wanting to know about the strange aliens who had shown no fear in the presence of Governor Velthar. Jake found it amusing that they were already famous, but he did not understand why everyone seemed so surprised by their behavior. Amy was fascinated by the communications they intercepted, and she spent hours analyzing the linguistic patterns and emotional content of the messages. She told Jake that many of the species seemed amazed that anyone could interact with the Xanthari as equals rather than as subjects or enemies. Tony was more interested in the technical specifications of their escort ship, and he had started a friendly conversation with the Xanthari engineering staff about drive efficiency and power distribution systems. Lisa was learning to pilot some of the smaller Xanthari craft, and she impressed their hosts with her natural ability to adapt to different control systems. The Xanthari pilots seemed to enjoy teaching her their techniques, and they spent long hours discussing flight tactics and navigation methods. Jake was pleased that his crew was making such good connections with their new friends. The imperial capital was unlike anything any of them had imagined. It was built around a massive space station that orbited a blue giant star, and the structure seemed to go on forever in all directions. There were docking bays and residential areas and what looked like entire cities built into the framework of the station. Ships of hundreds of different designs came and went constantly, and Jake could see representatives of dozens of alien species moving through the corridors. Jake had packed gifts from Earth, including coffee beans and chocolate bars, and several music recordings that he thought might interest the Xanthari leadership. Amy had brought scientific journals and research papers about human psychology and social development. Tony had some engineering manuals and blueprints for various human technologies. Lisa had pictures of Earth and recordings of human pilots performing aerobatic maneuvers. Their quarters in the Imperial Palace were larger than most human houses, and decorated with art from across the galaxy. Jake was impressed by the variety of styles and techniques represented in the collection, and he spent time examining pieces that seemed to tell stories about different civilizations. Amy was taking detailed notes about the cultural significance of various items while Tony was fascinated by the construction methods used in the palace itself. The palace was clearly designed to impress and intimidate visitors. The corridors were enormous and lined with statues of fierce-looking aliens in military poses. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into shadows, and the walls were covered with what appeared to be weapons and armor from conquered worlds. Jake thought it was a bit overdone, but he appreciated the craftsmanship involved in creating such an elaborate display. When they were finally brought before Emperor Zarthok, Jake was impressed by the sheer scale of the throne room. The space was larger than most sports stadiums and filled with representatives from dozens of different species, all standing in perfect silence. The Emperor himself sat on a throne that seemed to be carved from a single massive crystal, and he was surrounded by guards wearing armor that looked like it could stop nuclear weapons. Jake walked up to the throne with the same casual confidence he had shown Governor Velthar and introduced himself and his crew. He thanked the Emperor for the invitation and said that they were honored to visit such an impressive civilization. Amy immediately started taking notes about the political structure and the behavior of the various species present. Tony was examining the engineering involved in supporting such a massive chamber. Lisa was looking around at the different alien technologies on display. Emperor Zarthok was even more imposing than Governor Velthar had been. He was at least 8 feet tall, and his presence seemed to fill the entire throne room. His voice was deep enough to be felt as much as heard, and his eyes glowed with an inner fire that made Jake think of stars being born. When he spoke, the entire assembly seemed to hold its breath. He welcomed the humans to his empire and explained that he ruled over more worlds than they could count and commanded fleets that could destroy entire solar systems. He said that most species either submitted immediately to his authority or were crushed beneath the might of his military forces. He wanted to know what the humans hoped to accomplish by coming to his capital. Jake said that they were mostly interested in cultural exchange and learning about different civilizations. He mentioned that humans were naturally curious and that they enjoyed meeting new people and sharing ideas. Amy added that she was conducting research on comparative psychology and social structures across different species. Tony said that he was impressed by Zenthari engineering and would love to learn more about their techniques. Lisa had wandered over to examine the Emperor's throne, and she mentioned that the crystal work was beautiful, but that the ergonomics could probably be improved for better comfort during long ceremonies. She suggested that a few modifications might help prevent back problems while maintaining the impressive appearance. The Emperor stared at Lisa for a long moment and then asked if she understood that she was commenting on the throne of stars, which had been carved from the heart of a dying sun and had never been touched by anyone other than the imperial family. Lisa said that she had not known the history, but that it was still good craftsmanship even if it looked uncomfortable to sit on for extended periods. Amy chose that moment to ask the Emperor if she could interview him about imperial administration and leadership techniques for her research. She explained that human political science could probably benefit from studying his methods, and that comparative government was an important field of study. Tony mentioned that the throne room's acoustics were excellent and asked about the engineering principles used in its design. Jake noticed that many of the alien representatives in the throne room were staring at them with expressions that seemed to mix amazement with terror. He asked the Emperor if there was some protocol they were supposed to follow, because they did not want to accidentally offend anyone. The Emperor told him that most beings who entered his presence were unable to speak or move due to fear. Amy found this fascinating from a psychological standpoint, and she started asking questions about the evolutionary advantages of fear responses in different species. She wondered if the Emperor had ever considered that excessive fear might actually reduce the efficiency of his administration by preventing honest communication from his subordinates. The Emperor's council seemed to be having some kind of debate behind him, and Jake could hear heated discussions in several different languages. Some of the council members kept pointing at the humans while others seemed to be arguing about something. The Emperor raised his hand and the talking stopped immediately. He announced that the humans would remain at the capital as his guests while he decided what to do with them. Jake said that sounded fine and asked if there were any local attractions they should visit while they were there. Amy requested access to the Imperial Library for her research. Tony asked if he could tour some of the engineering facilities. Lisa wanted to know if there were any flight simulators she could try. As they were escorted to new quarters, Jake noticed that word of their audience with the Emperor was already spreading through the palace. Groups of aliens stopped their conversations to stare at them, and many seemed to be discussing what they had witnessed. Jake was beginning to suspect that their visit was having a bigger impact than he had expected, but he was not sure exactly what kind of impact it was. Jake had no idea that his casual conversation with Emperor Zarthok was being broadcast across the entire empire. Within days of their audience, recordings of the humans treating the Emperor like an ordinary person were spreading from world to world. Species that had lived in terror of imperial authority for centuries watched in amazement as Jake offered suggestions about government policy, and Amy asked for research interviews. The reaction was immediate and widespread. On dozens of worlds, beings who had never dared to question imperial rule began asking why they had to live in fear. Workers who had been forced into specialized roles for generations started wondering if they could learn new skills. Entire populations that had accepted their fate as conquered peoples began to imagine different possibilities. Amy was completely unaware of the revolution she was causing. She spent her days in the Imperial Library, researching alien psychology and interviewing various species about their social structures and cultural practices. Her questions about why certain groups were treated differently and how their societies had developed were the first time many beings had been asked to think critically about their circumstances. Tony was having similar effects in the engineering sectors. His casual discussions about human technology and his interest in learning Zenthari techniques were inspiring engineers and technicians to experiment with modifications to their equipment. Within weeks, beings across the empire were discovering that their tools and machines could be adapted for purposes beyond their original design. Lisa had started giving flying lessons to pilots from various species, and her approach to teaching was completely different from imperial training methods. Instead of following rigid procedures and accepting limitations, she encouraged creative problem-solving and individual expression. Pilots who had never been allowed to deviate from standard patterns were learning techniques that made them more effective in combat and navigation. Jake continued to have friendly conversations with imperial officials, and his suggestions about government efficiency and citizen welfare were being discussed in council meetings across the galaxy. His comment that people generally worked better when they were happy had become a rallying cry for reform movements on hundreds of worlds. The humans remained completely oblivious to the chaos they were creating. They thought they were just having interesting conversations and making friends with people from different cultures. When Imperial guards started treating them with unusual deference, they assumed it was normal hospitality. When alien servants asked them questions about human society, they thought it was natural curiosity. Emperor Zarthok was receiving reports of unrest from every corner of his empire, and his council was in a state of panic. Some advisors wanted to execute the humans immediately, while others believed they were supernatural beings who could not be harmed. A few suggested that the humans might be the prophesied liberators mentioned in ancient texts from conquered worlds. The Emperor himself was struggling with feelings he had never experienced before. For centuries, his power had been absolute and unquestioned, but the humans had spoken to him as if he were just another person with a difficult job. Their casual disregard for his authority was more unsettling than open. Rebellion would have been because they clearly meant no disrespect. The breaking point came when Jake suggested that the Emperor might want to consider holding regular meetings with representatives from different worlds to get feedback about imperial policies. He mentioned that human governments had found that citizen input usually led to better decision-making and reduced conflicts. Amy added that research showed that participatory governance increased productivity and social stability. Emperor Zarthok decided that the human problem had to be resolved before his empire collapsed completely. He announced that he would challenge Jake to single combat according to ancient tradition. The winner would determine the fate of humanity, and the loser would be destroyed along with everything they represented. Jake accepted immediately because he thought it sounded like an interesting cultural experience. Amy was excited about the opportunity to observe Zenthari combat psychology in action and she asked if she could take measurements and conduct interviews during the fight. Tony wanted to study the arena's engineering and the technology involved in the combat systems. Lisa asked if there were rules about coaching from the sidelines because she had some ideas about defensive strategies. The announcement of the combat challenge was broadcast across the Empire, and beings from thousands of worlds tuned in to watch what everyone expected would be the destruction of human arrogance. Instead, they saw Jake treating the most powerful being in the galaxy like a sparring partner and offering helpful suggestions about technique and strategy. When Emperor Zarthok demonstrated his ability to control energy and matter with his mind, Jake was genuinely impressed and asked if he could learn to do that too. When the Emperor created weapons from pure force, Jake complimented the craftsmanship and wondered about the physics involved. Amy was taking notes about the psychological aspects of the Emperor's power display, while Tony was analyzing the energy patterns. The combat itself was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of cowering in terror or fighting desperately for his life, Jake treated it like a friendly competition. He dodged the Emperor's attacks with casual grace and responded with techniques that were clearly designed to disable rather than destroy. When the Emperor increased his power, Jake adapted his strategy and offered tips on how to improve his form. The psychological effect on the watching galaxy was devastating to Imperial authority. Beings across thousands of worlds saw their terrifying Emperor being treated like an equal by a small human who showed no fear and offered constructive criticism. The image of absolute power was shattered and could never be rebuilt. The fight ended when Jake suggested they take a break because the Emperor looked tired. He offered to share some water and asked if there were any good restaurants nearby because all the exercise had made him hungry. Emperor Zarthok stared at him for a long moment and then began to laugh. The sound of the Emperor's laughter was broadcast across the Empire, and it changed everything. Beings who had lived in terror for generations realized that their oppressor was just another person, with strengths and weaknesses like everyone else. The fear that had held the Empire together for centuries evaporated in that moment of shared humanity. Jake asked if they could continue their conversation over dinner because he was curious about the Emperor's background and how he had built such an impressive civilization. Amy wanted to interview him about leadership psychology and the effects of absolute power on personality development. Tony was interested in the technology behind his abilities. Lisa suggested they all go flying together sometime because she thought the Emperor might enjoy seeing the galaxy from a pilot's perspective. The dinner that followed the combat was probably the most important meal in galactic history, although Jake just thought of it as a nice opportunity to try alien food and have an interesting conversation. Emperor Zarthok had never shared a meal with anyone as an equal, and he found the experience both strange and pleasant. Amy asked him about his childhood and his rise to power, while Tony wanted to know about the engineering challenges involved in building an interstellar empire. Jake told stories about Earth and human history, including some of the mistakes they had made along the way. He mentioned that humans had tried various forms of government over the centuries, and that they had learned that no single system worked perfectly for everyone. Amy added that research showed that societies evolved constantly, and that adaptation was usually more successful than rigid control. The Emperor found himself talking about subjects he had never discussed with anyone. He told them about the loneliness of absolute power and the burden of making decisions that affected billions of lives. He explained that the Empire had grown so large that he could not possibly understand all the different needs and problems of its citizens. Lisa suggested that maybe he needed help from people who understood local conditions better. Tony mentioned that human organizations worked best when they distributed responsibility among people with different skills and knowledge. He said that no single person could be an expert on everything, and that successful leaders usually surrounded themselves with advisors who could handle specialized problems. Amy noted that psychological research supported the benefits of collaborative decision-making for complex challenges. The conversation continued for hours, and by the end of it, Emperor Zarthok was asking the humans for advice about reforming his government. Jake suggested that he might want to start by asking his subjects what kind of changes they wanted to see. Amy recommended conducting surveys and focus groups to understand the needs of different species and cultures. Tony proposed creating advisory councils with representatives from various worlds and sectors. What the Emperor did not realize was that their dinner conversation was also being broadcast across the Empire. Beings on thousands of worlds heard their absolute ruler asking for advice and admitting that he needed help. The psychological transformation was complete and irreversible. The age of imperial terror was over and something new was beginning. Within weeks, the Empire was changing in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Species that had been enslaved for centuries were forming their own governments and making treaties with their former oppressors. The Xanthari military found itself transformed from an occupation force into a peacekeeping organization helping to mediate disputes between newly independent worlds. Jake and his crew spent several more weeks at the capital helping to facilitate the transition. Amy conducted workshops on conflict resolution and democratic processes, while Tony advised on infrastructure development and resource sharing. Lisa trained pilots from dozens of species in advanced techniques that improved both military and civilian operations. The humans remained largely unaware of the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They thought they were just helping some friends work through a difficult period of organizational change. When Emperor Zarthok officially dissolved the Empire and announced the formation of the Galactic Federation, Jake congratulated him on making a wise decision and offered to help with the paperwork if needed. The new Federation was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of being ruled by fear, it was governed by cooperation and mutual respect. Former slave worlds became equal partners with their former oppressors, and the Xanthari found that they were much happier as members of a community than as masters of an empire. Trade and cultural exchange flourished as beings who had been isolated for generations began to share ideas and resources. Amy was invited to establish the first galactic university where beings from all species could study together and learn from each other. Tony became the head of a new engineering consortium that shared technology and techniques across the Federation. Lisa founded the Galactic Pilots Academy, where the best flyers from every world could train together and develop new methods of space travel. Jake was offered the position of Federation president, but he declined because he said he was not really qualified for that kind of responsibility. Instead, he accepted the role of cultural ambassador, which allowed him to travel throughout the galaxy, meeting new species, and helping to establish diplomatic relationships. He enjoyed the work because it satisfied his natural curiosity about different civilizations. Emperor Zarthok became the first chancellor of the Federation, and he proved to be much better at cooperative leadership than he had been at absolute rule. He often said that the humans had taught him that real strength came from bringing out the best in others rather than crushing opposition through fear. Amy included his transformation in her research on the psychology of power and leadership change. After several months of helping with the transition, the human crew finally got their ship repaired and prepared to return to Earth. The New Horizon had been upgraded with Federation technology that would allow them to travel much faster and more safely than before. Jake was excited about sharing their discoveries with Earth, and he hoped that humans and the Federation could become good friends and trading partners. The farewell ceremony was attended by representatives from hundreds of worlds, and Jake was touched by the warmth of their goodbye wishes. Many beings thanked the humans for showing them that change was possible and that different species could work together as equals. Amy received honorary degrees from universities across the galaxy, and Tony was made an honorary member of dozens of engineering guilds. As the New Horizon departed from the capital, Jake looked back at the massive space station that had once been the center of a terrifying empire and was now the heart of a peaceful federation. He felt proud of what his crew had accomplished, even though he was not entirely sure how they had done it. Lisa set course for Earth while Tony ran final checks on their new drive systems. Amy was already planning her report on their mission, and she was excited about sharing their discoveries with the scientific community back home. She had enough research material to keep her busy for years, and she was particularly interested in writing about the psychological factors that had made the transformation possible. Tony was looking forward to showing human engineers some of the new techniques he had learned. Jake settled back in his captain's chair and watched the stars as they entered warp. He made a final log entry noting that their first contact mission had been successful, and that they had established friendly relations with a large galactic civilization. He mentioned that space exploration was even more interesting than he had expected, and he hoped that Earth would approve future missions to continue building relationships with their new friends. The New Horizon disappeared into warp space, carrying its crew home to Earth and leaving behind a galaxy that had been transformed by their simple decision to treat everyone they met with curiosity and respect. Behind them, the Galactic Federation continued to grow and prosper as beings across thousands of worlds learned to work together as equals rather than live in fear of their differences.